Close your eyes for a second and imagine you're a currency trader in London on September 16th, 1992. It's early morning, the market's just opened. You're watching your screen, and the British pound is falling. Fast. You see the Bank of England, one of the most powerful central banks in the world, desperately trying to stop it. They're buying pounds at a rate of 2 billion pounds per hour, burning through Britain's foreign currency reserves like they're on fire. At 10:30 a.m., the government makes an emergency announcement. They're raising interest rates from 10% to 12%. That's massive. That's the kind of move that should stop currency traders in their tracks. But it doesn't work. The pound keeps falling. A few hours later, they make another announcement. Interest rates are going to 15%. 15%. This is desperate. This is the financial equivalent of screaming, "Please stop selling our currency." But the selling doesn't stop. By 7 p.m., it's over. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Britain's finance minister, appears on television and announces that the UK is withdrawing from the European exchange rate mechanism. Britain has lost. The Bank of England has been defeated. And somewhere in New York, a Hungarian-American hedge fund manager named George Soros is about to make over $1 billion in profit in a single day by betting against the British government. This is the story of Black Wednesday, the day a hedge fund manager broke the Bank of England, the day Britain lost 27 billion pounds trying to defend its currency and failed, the day that changed British politics for a generation and kept the UK out of the euro forever. This is the story of how markets can overwhelm governments, how economic reality always wins against political prestige, and how one man saw what everyone else missed and made the trade of the century. Hey, I'm Brandon, and welcome back to My Money Mint, the channel where I dive into topics related to money and wealth. All right, let's get into it. To understand Black Wednesday, you need to understand what Britain got itself into in 1990. On October 8th, 1990, the United Kingdom joined something called the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, the ERM. This was a system designed to stabilize European currencies and prepare for eventual monetary union. The idea was simple. Member countries would peg their currencies to each other within narrow bands. Your currency could fluctuate a little, but not too much. You had to defend your exchange rate. For the UK, this meant pegging the pound to the German Deutsche Mark at a rate of 2.95 marks per pound, with a permitted fluctuation band of plus or minus 6%. So the pound could trade between approximately 2.78 and 3.13 marks. If it tried to fall below 2.78, the Bank of England would have to intervene, buy pounds, sell other currencies, raise interest rates, whatever it took to keep the pound above that floor. Now, why would Britain do this? The political context is crucial here. Margaret Thatcher had been Prime Minister since 1979. She was skeptical of European integration, hostile to the idea of giving up British sovereignty over monetary policy. She did not want to join the ERM, but she was under enormous pressure from within her own cabinet. Her Chancellor, the Finance Minister, Nigel Lawson, wanted Britain in the ERM. Her Foreign Secretary, Geoffrey Howe, wanted Britain in the ERM. They saw it as essential for Britain's relationship with Europe. In October 1989, Thatcher was eventually persuaded by John Major, who had become Chancellor after Lawson resigned, to join the ERM. But here's the problem. They joined at what most economists believed was too high a rate. At 2.95 marks per pound, the British pound was overvalued by about 10 to 15%. Britain's economy was far less competitive than Germany's. British inflation was running at about 3 times the German rate. British labor productivity was lower than France and Germany. Joining the ERM at this overvalued rate was like tying a weight around Britain's neck and jumping into a pool. The economic theory behind joining was that it would import German discipline. Germany's central bank, the Bundesbank, had incredible credibility for fighting inflation. By tying the pound to the mark, Britain would force itself to match German inflation levels without going through repeated boom-bust cycles. It would be an external anchor for monetary policy, but the reality was that Britain and Germany were in completely different economic situations, and those differences were about to get worse. In 1990, something massive happened: German reunification. East Germany and West Germany, divided since the end of World War II, were reuniting. This was historically momentous, emotionally powerful, and economically expensive. Germany invested over 2 trillion marks in rehabilitating the former East Germany. Think about that. An entire economy that had been run by communists for 45 years suddenly needed to be modernized, integrated, rebuilt. The Bundesbank, Germany's central bank, looked at this massive spending and said, this is going to cause inflation. So they did what central banks do when they're worried about inflation. They raised interest rates. The Bundesbank raised rates sharply through 1991 and 1992. The average rate climbed from 7.1% in 1989 to 8.5% in 1992-1990, to 9.2% in 1991, and to 9.5% in 1992. These high German interest rates made sense for Germany. They needed to control inflation from reunification spending. But for other countries in the ERM, including Britain, these high German rates were a disaster. Here's why. When you're in the ERM, you're essentially tying your monetary policy to Germany's. If German interest rates go up, yours have to go up too, or money will flow out of your country toward Germany seeking higher returns. Capital controls had been eliminated in the new European single market, so money could move freely across borders. High German interest rates sucked capital toward Germany like a vacuum cleaner. For Britain, this meant keeping interest rates high even though the British economy was falling into recession. In 1992, British interest rates were 10% despite the economy contracting. GDP growth averaged negative 0.2% from 1990 to 1992. Unemployment rose from 7% in 1990 to 1992, 9.9% by 1992, and would eventually hit 10.6% in 1993. The housing market was collapsing. In the late 1980s, British house prices had been surging, especially in London and the Southeast. But high interest rates and falling confidence caused house prices to drop by 10% in 1990. Home repossession rates skyrocketed. Many homeowners found themselves in negative equity. They owed more on their mortgages than their houses were worth. This was economically devastating and politically toxic. So by 1992, you had this situation. Britain was in recession, unemployment was rising, the housing market was collapsing, but interest rates had to stay high to defend the pound's value in the ERM. The economic fundamentals were screaming that Britain needed lower interest rates and a weaker currency to stimulate exports and growth. But the political commitment to the ERM meant Britain was trapped in exactly the opposite policy, and this is where George Soros enters the story. George Soros is one of the most successful investors in history. He was born in Hungary in 1930, survived the Nazi occupation, emigrated to England, and then to the United States. In 1970, he founded the Quantum Fund, a hedge fund that started with just $12 million. By 1987, it had grown to $21.5 billion. By 2011, it would have $25 billion. Soros had made his fortune through what he called reflexivity, the idea that markets aren't just passive reflectors of reality, but active participants in creating reality. He looked for situations where market perceptions and economic fundamentals were misaligned, where the tension between perception and reality would eventually cause a snap. And in 1992, Britain in the ERM was exactly that kind of situation. Soros looked at Britain and saw everything wrong. The pound was overvalued. British inflation was triple Germany's rate. British interest rates were hurting the economy. The government was in recession but couldn't lower rates because of the ERM commitment. Housing prices were collapsing. Unemployment was rising. The political will to maintain this painful policy was weakening. Stanley Druckenmiller, a senior portfolio manager at Soros's Quantum Fund, saw it too. Many historians actually credit Druckenmiller as the architect of the strategy that Soros got famous for. Druckenmiller looked at the UK's commitment to the ERM and high interest rates and concluded they were unsustainable given the weak domestic economy. Devaluation was inevitable. It was just a question of when. Now Soros wasn't alone in seeing this. Many currency traders were building short positions in sterling, betting that the pound would fall. But Soros went bigger than anyone else. By September 16, 1992, Soros's fund had sold short more than $10 billion worth of pounds. This is an enormous bet. This is the kind of position that can make or break a fund. This is Soros betting the farm that Britain would be forced to devalue. Here's how shorting a currency works, in case you're not familiar. Soros borrows pounds. Let's say he borrows 10 billion pounds. He immediately sells those pounds and buys German marks. Now he's sitting on a pile of marks, and he owes 10 billion pounds that he has to pay back eventually. If the pound falls in value against the mark, he can buy back those 10 billion pounds for fewer marks than he sold them for. The difference is his profit. But if the pound rises, he loses money. Soros was betting that Britain would be forced to devalue the pound or leave the ERM entirely. If that happened, the pound would fall sharply and his short position would make billions. But if Britain successfully defended the pound, if the Bank of England convinced markets that the 2.95 rate would hold, Soros would lose billions. This was a high-stakes bet against one of the world's most powerful central banks. And Soros wasn't the only one. Other hedge funds and institutional investors followed suit once they recognized the pound's vulnerability. There was a herd forming, a growing consensus among traders that the pound was doomed. The pressure on the Bank of England was building throughout the summer and early fall of 1992. Then, on the evening of Tuesday, September 15, 1992, something happened that triggered the final crisis. Helmut Schlesinger, the president of the Bundesbank, gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal. A German financial paper called Handelsblatt reported on this interview, and Schlesinger was quoted as saying that a more comprehensive realignment of currencies would be needed in the ERM. This was interpreted by markets as a signal that the Bundesbank, which ultimately held the power in the ERM system, thought currencies like the pound and the Italian lira needed to devalue. If the Bundesbank thought devaluation was inevitable, then traders betting against the pound had just received confirmation from the most important central bank in Europe. The markets opened in London on Wednesday, September 16, 1992, and immediately the selling began. The Bank of England started accepting orders of £300 million twice before 8:30 a.m., desperately trying to prop up the currency. It had little effect. Traders kept selling. The Bank of England kept buying at a rate of £2 billion per hour, burning through Britain's foreign currency reserves at a catastrophic pace. At 10:30 a.m., the government made an emergency announcement. Interest rates were being raised from 10% to 12%. This was a huge move. A 2 percentage point increase in one day is the kind of thing that should make traders think twice. Higher interest rates make holding pounds more attractive. You earn more interest on pound-denominated assets. This should have stemmed the selling. It didn't. The pound kept falling. Traders didn't believe that Britain could sustain 12% interest rates. The economy was already in recession. Unemployment was already rising. The housing market was already collapsing. How long could Britain really keep rates at 12% without causing massive economic and political damage? The market's answer was, not long. So they kept selling. A few hours later, the government made another desperate announcement. Interest rates were going to 15%. 15%. Think about what this means for ordinary people. If you have a mortgage, your payments are about to skyrocket. If you're a business trying to borrow money, forget it. 15% interest rates are crushing. This was the government essentially saying, we will destroy the economy if that's what it takes to keep the pound at 2.95 marks. But traders didn't believe it. They knew, everyone knew, that 15% interest rates were politically impossible to sustain. Prime Minister John Major's government had just barely won re-election in April 1992. A Gallup poll from September showed the Conservatives with a small lead of 2.5%. If they crashed the economy defending an arbitrary exchange rate, they'd be slaughtered in the next election. The political will wasn't there. Behind the scenes, throughout that day, there were emergency meetings at the highest levels of British government. Prime Minister John Major, Chancellor Norman Lamont, Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd, Trade Minister Michael Heseltine, Home Secretary Kenneth Clark, they're all meeting, trying to figure out what to do. The Bank of England is telling them that they're running out of foreign currency reserves. They've already spent billions, and the selling isn't stopping. Finally, at 7 p.m., it's over. Chancellor Norman Lamont appears on television and announces that Britain is withdrawing from the European exchange rate mechanism. The pound will no longer be pegged to the Deutsche Mark. It will float freely, finding its own level in the markets. Britain has lost. The Bank of England has been defeated. The commitment that was supposed to anchor British monetary policy and bring European integration has collapsed in humiliation. In total, the British government spent roughly £27 billion trying to defend the currency. Early estimates put the losses even higher. Some said 13 to 27 billion. The UK Treasury later estimated that trading losses in August and September were about £800 million, but the bulk of the loss came from non-realized profits. Basically, if they devalued earlier, they'd have made money on their foreign currency reserves instead of losing it defending an unsustainable rate. In 1997, the official cost was calculated at £3.14 billion, revised to $3.3 billion in 2005. But that's just the direct trading losses. The broader cost in terms of wasted reserves, economic damage from keeping rates too high for too long, and political consequences was far greater. And George Soros, in the week leading up to Black Wednesday, the Quantum Fund earned $1.8 billion by shorting British pounds and buying German marks. Soros's personal profit was estimated at over $1 billion. Think about that for a second. One man, betting against the British government, made over $1 billion in a single day. That works out to over £12 for every man, woman, and child in Britain. The British taxpayer essentially paid George Soros and other speculators billions of pounds for correctly recognizing that British economic policy was unsustainable. Soros became known as the man who broke the Bank of England. He didn't break it through some nefarious scheme or market manipulation. He broke it by recognizing reality. Britain was trying to maintain an overvalued currency during a recession while keeping interest rates high to defend that currency. This was economically insane. It couldn't last. Soros just bet bigger than anyone else that reality would win. And here's the really interesting part. Black Wednesday was actually good for Britain in the long run. I know that sounds crazy. How could losing £27 billion and suffering a humiliating defeat be good? But let me explain. Once Britain left the ERM, the pound devalued. It fell from 2.95 marks to around 2.50 marks. This made British exports more competitive. British goods were now cheaper for foreign buyers. More importantly, Britain could now cut interest rates. The Bank of England didn't have to keep rates high to defend an arbitrary exchange rate anymore. They could set rates based on what the British economy needed. By January 1993, interest rates had been cut from 10% to 6%. This stimulated the economy. Businesses could borrow more cheaply. Homeowners' mortgage payments fell. Consumer confidence began to recover. The UK economy boomed after Black Wednesday. Britain experienced almost 16 consecutive years of economic growth between the end of the 1991 recession and the 2008 financial crisis. That's the longest continued expansion on record. The devaluation of the pound had many positive effects, stimulating exports, allowing lower interest rates, enabling growth. In 1997, the incoming Labour government of Tony Blair made the Bank of England independent and gave it a clear mandate: target inflation at 2%. This inflation targeting framework, born from the ashes of Black Wednesday, served Britain well for over a decade. The Bank of England could now focus on domestic economic conditions rather than defending an exchange rate. Monetary policy actually made sense. But the political consequences were devastating for the Conservative Party. Remember that Gallup poll showing Conservatives with a 2.5% lead in September 1992? By October, after Black Wednesday, their share had plunged from 43% to 29%. A 16-point collapse in 1 month. The Conservatives had campaigned in the April election on their economic competence, on being the party of sound money and financial responsibility. Black Wednesday destroyed that reputation overnight. Prime Minister John Major never recovered politically. He remained Prime Minister until 1997, but his government was weakened, divided, and tainted by the humiliation of Black Wednesday. Chancellor Norman Lamont, who had been on television announcing the ERM exit, was sacked in May 1993. He gave a resignation speech saying the government gave the impression of being in office but not in power. In the 1997 general election, the Conservatives were crushed. Tony Blair's Labour Party won by a landslide. Major himself was re-elected in his own constituency with a reduced majority, but 133 other Conservative MPs were defeated, including present and former cabinet ministers like Norman Lamont, Malcolm Rifkind, and Michael Portillo. The Conservatives wouldn't return to government until David Cameron led them to victory in 2010, 13 years later. And Black Wednesday had one other huge consequence. It basically killed any chance of Britain joining the euro. When European countries moved toward a single currency in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Britain stayed out. The UK had secured an opt-out during the Maastricht Treaty negotiations in 1992, and after Black Wednesday, there was no political will to give up the pound. Tony Blair's Labour government was actually in favor of joining the euro, but only if certain economic tests were met. They never were, partly because the economic tests were designed to be very hard to meet, and partly because public opinion was massively opposed. Polls showed opposition to adopting the euro at up to 75%. Black Wednesday was seen as proof that a monetary union couldn't work, that trying to tie different economies to the same currency was impossible when those economies had different needs. And Britain wasn't alone in suffering during the ERM crisis. On the same day, Britain left the ERM, September 16, 1992, Italy pulled the lira out too. Italy had been facing similar pressures, with concerns about its fiscal position and lack of economic convergence with Germany. Spain devalued the peseta by 5% on Black Wednesday, then had to devalue again by 6% in November 1992, and a third time by 6.5% in May 1993. By May 1993, Portugal and Ireland had also devalued their currencies. The entire ERM system was under stress. In August 1993, the 12 EMS countries agreed to expand the fluctuation margins from 2.25% on either side of parity to 15% on either side. This basically meant currencies could move much more freely. The fixed exchange rate system had essentially become a floating exchange rate system with very wide bands. So, what are the lessons from Black Wednesday? First, fixed exchange rates are vulnerable when economic fundamentals are misaligned between countries. Germany needed high interest rates because of reunification. Britain needed low interest rates because of recession. You can't force two different economies to have the same monetary policy when their needs are opposite. Second, markets can overwhelm central banks when defending unsustainable currency pegs. The Bank of England had enormous resources and credibility, but it couldn't fight economic reality. When traders collectively decide a currency is overvalued, and when the fundamentals support that view, no amount of intervention can stop the market. Third, interest rate policy must match domestic economic conditions, not just external commitments. Britain tried to keep rates high to defend the ERM commitment, while the economy desperately needed lower rates. This is backward. Economic policy should serve the economy, not abstract political commitments. Fourth, political prestige cannot substitute for economic reality in currency markets. The British government was politically committed to staying in the ERM. They'd staked their reputation on it. They thought willpower and determination could maintain the pound at 2.95 marks. Markets didn't care about their determination. Markets cared about whether the policy was sustainable. It wasn't. And fifth, this is the big one, there's something called the impossible trinity, or trilemma, in economics. It says that a country cannot simultaneously maintain a fixed exchange rate, independent monetary policy, and free capital flows. You can have two of those three, but not all three. Britain tried to have all three. They wanted a fixed exchange rate to the mark, they wanted independent monetary policy, and capital could flow freely across borders. This is impossible. Britain learned this lesson the hard way. After Black Wednesday, Britain chose independent monetary policy and free capital flows, which meant the exchange rate had to float. This worked much better. The Eurozone countries later chose a fixed exchange rate between members and free capital flows, which meant giving up independent monetary policy. They all now use the same currency, and the European Central Bank sets policy for everyone. Different choice, but consistent with the trilemma. Now there's a question that gets debated. Was George Soros a villain or a hero? Did he cause Black Wednesday? Or did he just correctly identify an inevitable crisis and profit from it? Critics argue that speculators like Soros created a self-fulfilling prophecy. By betting against the pound, they caused the pound to fall, which proved their bet correct. They attacked a currency that might have survived without their speculation, but most economists disagree with this. The fundamental problem was that Britain was in the ERM at an overvalued exchange rate with economic policies that were killing the domestic economy. This was unsustainable regardless of what speculators did. Soros and other traders didn't create the crisis, they recognized it. They saw what should have been obvious to everyone, that Britain would eventually have to devalue or leave the ERM. In fact, you can argue that speculators like Soros performed a public service. They forced Britain out of an unsustainable policy sooner rather than later. Every day Britain stayed in the ERM, they were burning through foreign reserves, keeping interest rates unnecessarily high, and damaging the economy. By forcing a crisis in September 1992, speculators ended a bad policy and allowed Britain to start recovering sooner. And the British economy did recover spectacularly after leaving the ERM. The 16 years of growth that followed were among the best in British economic history. If Britain had somehow managed to stay in the ERM for another year or two, the economic damage would have been even worse, and the eventual exit would have been even more expensive. There's also an interesting parallel to draw with modern situations. Think about countries today that try to maintain fixed exchange rates or currency pegs when their economic fundamentals don't support it. Argentina has repeatedly tried to peg its currency to the dollar, only to face crisis after crisis. Many emerging market countries face similar pressures, trying to maintain a stable exchange rate while dealing with inflation, capital flight, and economic instability. The lesson of Black Wednesday is that these pegs will break if the fundamentals don't support them. Markets are ruthless about exposing unsustainable policies. Governments can try to use reserves, raise interest rates, impose capital controls, make political commitments, but if the underlying economics don't work, eventually the market wins. George Soros, for his part, has said he doesn't feel guilty about breaking the Bank of England. He's argued that he was simply recognizing an economic reality and acting on it. In his view, the British government put itself in an impossible position, and traders like him just identified the inevitable outcome. The government's blame rests with the policymakers who joined the ERM at the wrong rate and tried to maintain an unsustainable policy. And here's something that often gets forgotten. Black Wednesday's legacy extends all the way to Brexit. The ERM crisis reinforced Euroscepticism within the British Conservative Party. It created a narrative that European integration was dangerous for Britain, that surrendering monetary sovereignty was a mistake. This skepticism about Europe festered for decades. By 2016, when Prime Minister David Cameron called a referendum on EU membership, that skepticism had grown into a movement. The Brexit campaign argued that Britain should take back control from Brussels, that European integration constrained British sovereignty. This argument had its roots in experiences like Black Wednesday, the sense that European commitments forced Britain into bad economic policies. In January 2020, Britain formally left the European Union. You can draw a straight line from Black Wednesday in 1992 to Brexit in 2020. The humiliation of that day, the sense that European commitments damaged British interests, the belief that Britain was better off with independent monetary policy, these ideas shaped British politics for a generation. So here we are, over 30 years later. Black Wednesday is remembered as one of the most dramatic days in modern financial history. The day a hedge fund manager bet against a central bank and won. The day Britain learned that political commitments can't override economic reality. The day that changed British politics, kept Britain out of the euro, and set the stage for Brexit decades later. George Soros made over $1 billion and became known as the man who broke the Bank of England. But the real story isn't about one man's profit. It's about the fundamental tension between fixed exchange rates and economic sovereignty, about what happens when governments try to maintain policies that markets recognize as unsustainable, about how financial markets can force political change. The Bank of England learned its lesson. Britain learned its lesson. The Conservative Party learned its lesson, though they learned it through electoral defeat. And future policymakers around the world learned that you can't fight the market forever. Economic reality always wins in the end. Black Wednesday wasn't a tragedy for Britain. It was a necessary correction that allowed the economy to recover and grow. The real tragedy would have been staying in the ERM even longer, doing even more damage to the economy, wasting even more resources defending an indefensible position. Sometimes losing is winning, sometimes breaking is healing, sometimes the market knows better than the government, and sometimes a Hungarian immigrant with a hedge fund can see what an entire government can't. That economic reality doesn't care about political commitments, that unsustainable policies will eventually collapse, and that betting on inevitable outcomes isn't villainy, it's just good investing. Thank you for watching My Money Mint. If this story of how one trader took on a central bank and won got you thinking about market dynamics and economic policy, smash that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Was George Soros a villain who attacked Britain? Or did he simply recognize an inevitable crisis? And what other financial crises should I break down? I'll see you in the next one.